It's all kicking off in the last 24 hours within the UFC. We have staph infections, inbreds, and the return of Nick Diaz. We're going to get into it. Before we do, if you could hit subscribe, I'd really appreciate that. Helps me jump out of the D-rankings and demonetization and gets me back on track. I'd really appreciate it. Cheers. Nick Diaz is back. He will face Vicente Luque at UFC Abu Dhabi card August 3rd, 5-round co-main event per Dana White. Dana White was extremely excited about this. A lot of people weren't. A lot of people were shouting and ranting and raving about Tony Ferguson being on the same card fighting Michael Chiesa, and I was one of them. First time I saw it, I was like, Michael Chiesa versus Tony Ferguson? Michael Chiesa is a bit of a soy boy, but he's definitely a bigger dude than Tony Ferguson. Tony's on an 8-fight losing streak. I don't think that's a great matchup. Nick Diaz hasn't won a fight in 11 years. Last time we saw him in the octagon versus Robbie Lawler, he actually was overweight, didn't look interested, walked around for the entire week with a face on as if it was a chore to be there. Wasn't exactly what we wanted. But as I said, the moving parts to this are, when we hear the list of people that Nick Diaz was supposed to fight and that the UFC were actually trying to put together, it was Colby Covington, it was Kevin Holland, it was Michael Venom Page. All these lads are in the welterweight division and they're moving around. Colby's actually up around the top of that. He also wanted to fight GSP, but that was more of a PlayStation type of fight. You couple these names with the videos that we've seen coming out through social media of Nick Diaz training, he seems to be taking it seriously. Maybe he actually wants to come back and make some sort of impact within that 170 division. The fight against Vicente Luque, that's another interesting point, because if we think about Vicente Luque, the last time he was booked, I believe, was against Ian Gary. We know what happened there. Ian Gary bounced out of press conferences, bounced out of fight week, pretended to be sick, ran away, did a fake photo shoot pretending to be sick in 3 or 4 different locations, and he got rewarded by the UFC with a fight with Jeff Neal just a couple of weeks later. Vicente Luque, as far as we know, didn't even get paid. He didn't get rewarded with much. Now he's got this big fight with Nick Diaz. What does it say about Vicente Luque? We know that he has had trouble in the last couple of years. We know that he's had that bleed on the brain. He's come back. He's done well against the likes of RDA, and he got hockeyed against the likes of Joaquin Buckley. So is this a good fight for Vicente Luque versus Nick Diaz? I think it's a decent fight. Most people that are covering the story talk about Vicente Luque being on a kind of a decline. He's 33 years old, but are the UFC looking at Vicente Luque like he's the type of guy, Robbie Lawler, Nick Diaz, these guys that are literally at the end of their career and we're just giving them these token fights? Is that what it was? Because there's questions to be asked of that mentality, given the fact that his last fight was against Ian Gary and how everybody was speaking so highly of Vicente Luque just 3 or 4 months ago in that Ian Gary fight, saying it was going to be the biggest challenge of his life. Now all of a sudden it's 2 or 3 months later and he's a guy who's on the decline, he's at the end of his career and he's getting some kind of token spectacle fight out in Abu Dhabi with Nick Diaz. Interesting connotations. Michael Chiesa versus Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson's after losing 8 in a row, I believe. Michael Chiesa is a bit of a soy boy. He is what he is. He's a big dude. I think that this is not a great matchup for Tony Ferguson. Do I believe that Tony versus Nick would have been the one to make? I don't know. If you're a fan of Nick Diaz, like a lot of people jumped into the comment sections of videos across the board last night and they were saying maybe Nick wants to make a run at it. Maybe he's serious this time. He's 41 years old. Maybe he wants to come back and beat Vicente Luque, that people put a lot of praise on, but obviously not the UFC, because they're giving him these kind of token spectacle fights that you only get really at the end of your career. But we'll say like the community in general give a lot of respect to Vicente Luque. Maybe if the UFC were looking at Vicente Luque as like an active welterweight contender, or you know, someone that is in the top 10 and actively fighting, then they would have matched him up with Michael Chiesa. That might have been a better return fight or a better rewarding fight after the Ian Gary fiasco, but we don't know. Tony Ferguson, I can't see him coming out on top on this one. Absolutely not. When we look at the whole package of Chiesa versus Ferguson, Nick Diaz versus Vicente Luque, it's a bizarre one. It's a strange one. It's something that we will watch, of course. And I'm not sure where I land in terms of should it have been Nick Diaz versus Tony Ferguson and Chiesa versus Vicente Luque. But as I said, plenty of moving parts there in terms of connotations for that top 10 welterweight division. As we know, Dustin Poirier is taking on Islam Makhachev this weekend. I already made my predictions on a live stream the other night. I actually think that Makhachev might go in there because of the confidence coming off the Volkanovski knockout and the fact that he's improved so much on the feet that he's going to come in there and try to stand and bang with Dustin. If he does, he's going to go out. That's what my prediction was, and I was putting my money on Dustin Poirier to get the job done this Saturday night. Now we have this whole scenario with the staph infection. He's got the old crater there on his shin bone. Conor McGregor called it out, which I thought was lovely and nice. And it's very funny that when Conor calls out these boys for being inbreds, it's like a triggering effect in your brain. You're like, oh yeah, they are that, aren't they? Conor says staph again. This inbred, however, lives with staph. This team is infested. Make no mistake. Scruff balls, whatever yous are at. I suppose he's still still subs Dustin in the first. A lot of people are saying that Islam Makhachev is going to bounce in there, take the guy down and submit him with a rear naked choke in the first round. That might happen, but I would actually like to see Dustin do it this time. I would really like to see him do it. In terms of the press that he's done this week and talking about why he actually wants to get in there and do it, I'm all about it. I'm all about it. I'd like to see him get the job done. Staph infection again. Is that going to play a big, huge part in Islam Makhachev? I don't know, because it's kind of a balancing act, like, isn't it? People say that when you take the antibiotics that it depletes your energy and your cardio. But we also know that these inbred lads over on that side of the world are actually maybe supplementing that with something else. Maybe there's something else juicy flying around in there. I know that you've got a jacket there for 50 clean tests or something like that. Sure, we all believe that. So I don't know much how emphasis this staph infection, if it is staph infection, is going to have on Saturday night, but it will be very interesting and a nice little bit of controversy within the last 24 hours to talk about. That brings us to Sean Strickland, who's gone off on everybody. You know, he's doing his press conference thing this week. He's gone after Tom Brady. He's gone after the UFC for the garbage new gloves. He says that they're too wide, they're going to create cuts, that they're not the best fit, and whoever came up with them are kind of dorkish. Okay, let's see how that plays out this weekend with these new gloves. He also has gone in after the UFC in terms of a fighter pay, and he says that it's bullshit, and he says that the people that are running the place are getting huge money and they're getting shit. And it's a very important question and a very important topic for him to bring up, and it kind of begs the question then of, like, how annoyed is he with the UFC if he's going live, if he's talking to Daniel Cormier and he's actually going after his bosses? Does this play into what I was saying recently in terms of him being perturbed and out of sorts because of the way he's been treated? Possibly so, because I think that this is maybe a little step further than he normally goes. Normally he will go after everybody that you can imagine, but not too much Dana White or Hunter or the UFC brass. He doesn't go after them too much, so he's doing it here. People are loving it. Of course, Ariel and Brendan Schaub were probably creaming themselves when they saw this little clip go out last night, because you know that they love to see the UFC as an organization get pulled down as much as they can. So it was definitely interesting to see Sean Strickland go after the UFC. It was definitely interesting to see him talk so much shit. We had Kevin Holland talking about the UFC, about Nick Diaz fighting over in Abu Dhabi, how smoking weed over there is banned and that's why he wouldn't go there, and how the UFC put him in certain places that they know it's legal. So that opens up another question with the Nick Diaz stuff, going over to Abu Dhabi to fight on that card. A lot of moving parts in the last 24 hours, and I think it's just the beginning. As we get closer and closer to Saturday night, I think stories are going to keep unraveling and it's going to be extremely interesting. Let me know your thoughts down below. Maybe hit like, subscribe and share if any of this made sense. Cheers.